At first, they were supposed to just get in a room and hash it out. There was no place for the commoner to vote there. And the House of the Commons, the House of Representatives, the people who could vote in elections for those offices and could vote for the state offices that then elected the senators at that time, was a very constricted franchise. It was constricted by property ownership in the vast majority of states. It varied from state to state. Some states had broader franchises. Some states had much more restricted ones. Rhode Island had a notoriously restrictive franchise. Pennsylvania had a relatively more open one. None of them were anything that we would recognize as universal, forgetting of obviously the fact that women and Native Americans and blacks were not allowed to vote. Even among white males, the franchise was restricted because the people who created the Constitution wanted it that way. And so in their mind, the factions that would make the system they'd created impossible to work wouldn't emerge because everyone within government would be of the same essential class. They would all be ruling class, broadly construed, and they would therefore be able to look out for the common interest, which of course was synonymous with their class interests. And so that was the conception of the Constitution, that it was designed to keep the great beast, as Hamilton called the regular Americans, away from the levers of power, and to allow the ruling classes of the respective states to gentlemanly work out their conflicts in a way that prevented any one of them from becoming too powerful. But what they didn't realize, and they should have, honestly, is that even within a ruling class, there are conflicting interests. And the funny thing is it's not like they even had to be terribly smart to think that. They could have just looked across the pond at the country that they were emerging from. Already, by the time the American Revolution had happened, the Parliament of Great Britain had within it political factions, the Whigs and the Tories. And they were divided broadly by what sort of ruling class they represented. The Tories were the party of the rural big landowners, the sort of feudal remnants, and the Whigs were the party of the emergent capitalist urban merchant class. And they were fucking daggers drawn. They were fighting all the time. And you would think that the American founders would have looked across, seen that, and thought, oh, what if that happens here? And instead, you look at the Federalist Papers, and they really just said, no, we're fine. And one of the big reasons for that, the reasons that they thought America would be an exception, is the same thing that is the answer to any question of what is exceptional about America. What is exceptional about America? It is not that we were magically sprinkled with the fairy dust of Athens and Jerusalem, like Ben Shapiro says, or the spirit of John Locke impregnated the minds of men and turned them into these perfect subjects of liberal propriety. No. The reason America is exceptional, and the founders knew this, that they were grounded enough not to buy their own bullshit too much, is what Tim Heidecker would call free real estate.
It's free real estate.
The thing that makes America exceptional to all European powers, the thing that makes it its own thing, the thing that throughout its history has made America feel like a country apart, is the mere brute fact that there were always, for the vast majority of its history, endless amounts of land that could be taken from its native proprietors and then given over at basically no cost to white settlers. That reality is what shapes America's political institutions and political ideology and political imagination. Greg Grandin's new book, The End of the Myth, is very good on this, and I recommend it highly. That any kind of conflict that might have ground the gears of government to a halt would, in the minds of the founders, would always be assuaged eventually by westward movement. Class conflict, both within classes and between classes, would always be soothed by the fact that people could just pick up and move west. There was another native tribe to be expropriated from. There was more land to be given away. And as such, none of these conflicts would ever reach the point where they created a crisis of legitimacy or a crisis of functionality in the American political system. Now, even with that in their minds, very shortly after the establishment of the constitutional system, factions emerged. The Federalists and the Democrat Republicans pop up almost simultaneously with the establishment of the American government. And it really does turns out that what happens is that the different sectors of the ruling class could end up having conflicting policy interests. Oops. But the reality of that was at first masked by a geographic happenstance, which is that divide ended up largely being represented through states, in a way that was something that they had anticipated, because due to geography, due to richness of soil, and a whole bunch of factors, the South became a slave-based agricultural society, and the North quickly became a more urban, trade-based, and then after the Industrial Revolution, industrial-based capitalist social order. And so, even though sectional conflicts like those were anticipated by the founders, the Civil War still ended up revealing the whole thing to be incredibly brittle and incapable of managing even the factionalism that was built into it, that was assumed. It really is kind of astounding to think about. They had planned for that. They had planned for states having conflicting interests. And with it less than 100 years of them establishing the system, there could only be a resolution of a conflict over slavery through an incredibly violent civil war. So once again, take a fucking bow, you powdered wig-wearing chumps. So after the Union won the Civil War, they sadly botched a real golden opportunity to really just fucking rip that shit up and start over again. To just, at the point of a gun, because they had a lot of them, and the South was prostrate, re-establish the basis of government. Sadly, they didn't. They settled for working within the parameters of the system. They added a few very good constitutional amendments, the usefulness of which, though, was incredibly predicated on who was in power at the time. But the most important thing about the Civil War is that it forged a post-war political order that defined the parties along sectional lines in a way that masked the fundamental dysfunctional system that the Constitution had created. Because after the Civil War, parties were broadly aligned along regional identity and not ideology. And that allowed for people to accumulate some very fucked up notions of how the system was supposed to work. Now, the system that emerged after the Civil War is the system that we have inherited today of two major political parties that contest for power in basically every election, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats, after the Civil War, were the party of the defeated South and also of the northern ethnic immigrant enclaves of like the East Coast, Boston, New York, etc. Whereas the Republican Party was the party of the yeoman northern farmer and the emerging middle class. And then at the very top, of course, the emerging industrialist powers were funding both of them. The most clear way to represent specifically how this was working is the fact that in the years after the war, almost every contested election was between a Republican from Ohio and a Democrat from New York State. It's actually uncanny when you look back. The Republicans were almost entirely former Union generals from Ohio, and the Democratic candidate was almost always a senator or governor from New York. That was because even the political base, the majority of the political base of the Democratic Party was in the South, but in the immediate aftermath of the war, it would not have been viable for a politician from the former Confederacy, from the treasonous Confederacy that had killed so many young men from the North, to contest for national power. They would have been easily defeated by what was known as waving the bloody shirt, which was a propaganda move that Republican politicians would engage in, where it was started, I believe, by Benjamin Butler on the House floor, where you would hold up a shirt stained with the blood of some young patriot who had fallen in the war and remind people of the essential treasonousness and perfidy of the Southerners. So there was no way, even though the vast majority of votes and electoral votes specifically that were going to be part of any Democratic winning coalition were in the South, the front man, the candidate running for president, had to be from the North. And because of New York City, because of the dominance of New York City, and because of the power of the Democratic machine in New York City, New York was where the Democratic Party was most powerful outside of the South. And so you had these generals from Ohio, the second most populous state in the North besides New York, the home to so many brave generals who had fought valiantly in the war, and fighting it out at the ballot box with these Democrats from New York. And that conflict, that regional conflict, went on. The battle was joined. The issue of Reconstruction was incredibly important. And meanwhile, the rising industrial capitalism that was coming out of the Civil War was doing its best to co-opt the entire political system and bring about the extravagance of capital accumulation and exploitation that we like to call the Gilded Age, leading to massive failure, massive dislocation, massive fall in living standards for regular Americans, misery, horror, even as these huge, monstrous Carnegie and Rockefeller fortunes were being made. And that is why when the progressive movement arose in response to this as a acknowledgement by the literate middle classes and the more enlightened capitalists of both parties that this was a fundamentally unstable situation, and that the failure to reform would inevitably lead to some sort of violent revolution. It was already one of the most violent labor movements the world had seen at that point in the United States. Labor violence in the U.S. made everything in Europe look like nothing comparatively. In both parties, a consensus around progressive reform emerged, which is why you had the situation where you had Teddy Roosevelt inaugurating the